Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. Starting off, we'll take a quick look at the warnings that we do have out for the area. Starting off by Kodiak Island, we do have a winter weather advisory out for snow and blowing snow. Should be expiring fairly soon, 6 p.m. tonight on Tuesday. Up by the Valdez area, we do have a blizzard warning out that is specifically for Thompson Pass, and that is going to be out until 3 p.m. on Wednesday. Moving across to the other side, we do have some winter storm warnings for the northern part of Lynn Canal area. That does include both Haines and Skagway, and that is going to be in effect till 6 a.m. on Wednesday, and that is for heavy snow. And one more thing of note, up by the Fairbanks area, we do have air quality alerts that are out, and those are going to start 7 p.m. this evening on Tuesday and go until noon on Wednesday. And those are for two areas specifically. Fairbanks is a stage 1 alert, and the North Pole is a stage 2 alert. If those are your areas, please check out their quality alert to get further details. Moving ahead, we can check out our satellite imagery. We have a low pressure system south of the Gulf starting to bring a lot of warmer air up towards the southeastern part of the state and out by the northern Gulf Coast as well, pushing some cloud cover out over southeastern Alaska. However, if you look out over the mainland, not a lot of cloud cover up there, allowing for some colder temps overnight, but keeping the precip further to the south with that high pressure building in. As we move off to the west, we can see a low pressure system out near the Aleutian Islands with a lot of cloud cover out ahead of that, out over much of the Bering Sea, bringing some precipitation out over the islands out over there. Along the west coast of the state, not a lot of cloud cover, keeping a lot of, or the higher pressure up there, keeping a lot of the precipitation and impacts further to the south. Taking a look now at the remainder of today's weather, we can see that low pressure system out over the Aleutian Islands, bringing up some warmer air, but still for now we do have snow primarily along the Aleutian Islands, out towards the Alaska Peninsula as well, not quite making it to the Pribilof Islands at this point. And we can see our high pressure coming in out from over Russia, keeping a lot of the area clear of precipitation, but there is strong enough winds out over the YK Delta to pick up some of the loose snow and bring us some blowing snow conditions. Then out over the eastern part of the interior, high pressure out there as well, just some lighter showers up along the Arctic coastline, but primarily this high pressure is keeping a lot of the precipitation south, isolated primarily along the North Gulf Coast, and primarily snow there. However, some of the warmer air coming up from the south starting to transition over some of the snow to rain near the coastline. Then down in southeast Alaska, snow in those northern locations, but that warmer air coming in, transitioning things over to rain, starting with areas in the south. As we move into tonight, we can see that frontal system pushing well into the Panhandle area, bringing up that long fetch of warmer air, a lot of heavier precipitation along the islands, and then as we get further inland, transitioning that rain over to snow, holding on to snow for areas up in the northern part of Lynn Canal. Then as we move out over south central Alaska, heaviest precipitation is going to be along the coastline. As we get past the coastal range, is going to be diminished amounts or pretty dry for a lot of those locations until we get up into the southeastern parts of the interior, where we're going to see some lighter snow up there. Then along the Arctic coastline, going to see some snow in the eastern locations, with high pressure continuing to dominate the northern part of the state. Some stronger winds kicking up tonight in the Norton Sound area and St. Lawrence Island area, going to bring some blowing snow conditions there. And then our low pressure lingering by the western Aleutian Islands, continuing to bring showers out towards the western Aleutian Islands, all the way out through the eastern Aleutian Islands and into the Alaska Peninsula. However, in the central locations, we are going to see warm enough air to transition over that snow to rain. As we move into Wednesday, continuing to see a mix of rain and snow for the the central Aleutian Islands, but snow extending out for the western Aleutians down to the Pribilof Islands and the Alaska Peninsula. Up along the Arctic coastline, high pressure continuing to dominate, keeping the area void of precipitation, and that's going to extend down into the interior, with the exception of the far eastern parts of the interior, where we will still see some snow showers. Our low pressure system is now pushing into the northern parts of the Gulf of Alaska, continuing to bring warmer air to the Panhandle area, transitioning over much of the snow to rain at this point. However, some of the more northern locations holding on to snow through the day on Wednesday. Continuing to see snow and rain along the North Gulf Coast into Prince William Sound, eastern parts of the Kenai Peninsula, and down into Kodiak Island as well, with another system on the way. Then on Thursday, that low is pushing in along the Gulf Coast, continuing that southerly flow of mixture of rain and snow for the Panhandle area, snow primarily in locations further to the north, and then rain and snow throughout Prince William Sound area, blocked by the coastal ranges, so much of the interior locations around Cook Inlet or in the Copper River Basin should be pretty dry. And then in the Alaska range, going to see some snow showers in eastern portions of the interior, but high pressure continuing to reside along the northern part of the state, keeping the area pretty clear of any kind of snow. And then that's going to extend down the west coast as well into the Bristol Bay area. Out over the Bering Sea, we are going to see some snow showers extending out over the Pribilof Islands, and then some lighter snow for the central and western Aleutian Islands out by the eastern Aleutian Islands as well. Taking a look now at our temperature map, we can see on Wednesday morning temperatures dropping to just about freezing, a little bit lower as we get into the Alaska Peninsula, and down into the single digits as we make it into the Bristol Bay area. Just below 0 for the YK Delta area. Macquarie a little bit warmer there, dropping down to 4 degrees above 0. Below 0 for the Norton Sound area, and then into the minus teens as we get into the Kotzebue Sound area, and minus 30s as we get along the Arctic coastline. Coldest spot in the state for Wednesday morning is going to be in Fort Yukon area, and then minus 20s throughout much of the rest of the interior. As you get further south, however, going to start to warm up into the negative single digits, and on the other side of the Alaska range, staying above 0 for most locations. Glen Allen a little bit colder there, dropping down to minus 10. Down in the Panhandle area, going to stay above freezing for the most part. Some of the more northern locations dropping down to just below freezing. As we move into Wednesday afternoon, picking up to around 40 degrees all around the Panhandle, getting up above freezing along the North Gulf Coast, staying in the 20s for the Cook Inlet area, in the teens in the Copper River Basin, and then in the single digits for the southern locations of the interior. But as we get further to the north, dropping down below 0 or staying below 0 for Wednesday afternoon, and then staying in the minus 20s along the Arctic coastline. Negative single digits for the Kotzebue Sound area, positive single digits on the other side of the Seward Peninsula, single digits for much of the YK Delta as well, but getting into the 20s as we get into the Bristol Bay area, and getting above freezing for the Alaska Peninsula, and just below 40 as we get into the Aleutian Islands. Then moving into Thursday morning, dropping down to right around freezing for much of the Aleutian Islands, and in the teens for the Bristol Bay area. Going below 0 for the YK Delta area, extending up towards Nome as well at minus 2 there. Kotzebue Sound area in the negative teens, and then negative 30s all along the Arctic coastline. Negative 20s in much of the interior part of the state, and then in the teens for around Cook Inlet and down into areas by Kodiak Island. A little warmer there in Kodiak City, 29 degrees for that low, and then into the 30s for the Panhandle area. Thursday afternoon, getting up into the 40s for the Panhandle, getting up above freezing along the Arctic coastline and Kodiak Island, right about freezing for much of the rest of South Central, with the exception Glen Allen going to stay a little bit colder there. Into the single digits for southern interior, minus single digits for the northern interior, minus 20s along the Arctic coastline, and then getting back into the single digits as we get into the YK Delta area and into the upper 30s along the Aleutian Islands.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a quick look at our flying weather. On Wednesday morning, out over southern part of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we have IFR and MVFR conditions expected. The MVFR conditions are going to extend out east towards Kodiak Island and up along the North Gulf Coast up to the Kenai Peninsula area and into Prince William Sound, with some isolated areas of MVFR along the Alaska range and into the eastern parts of the interior and Arctic coastline. Out over the eastern part of the Gulf and into all of southeast Alaska, we are expecting to see IFR conditions Wednesday morning. Wednesday afternoon, IFR conditions staying out over the Panhandle, extending west along much of the North Gulf Coast through much of the Gulf of Alaska, and then just off the coastline we are going to still see some MVFR conditions around South Central and all along the Alaska range, down in Kodiak Island as well. VFR conditions expected further to the north in mainland Alaska and down the west coast of the state. Out in the interior part of the Bering Sea, down in the Aleutian Islands, widespread MVFR and IFR conditions expected. Thursday morning, continuing to see much IFR conditions out over the Bering Sea and through the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula, with some of those MVFR conditions pushing into southwest Alaska Thursday morning. Still expecting MVFR and IFR conditions over Kodiak Island, extending up into southern portions of the Alaska range as well. Throughout the Gulf of Alaska, expecting MVFR conditions, and it's through some areas of the eastern part of South Central Alaska into the Alaska range, and then eastern portions of the interior with the upper Yukon Valley expecting MVFR. Down in southeast Alaska, MVFR conditions are also expected. Thursday afternoon, going right back down to IFR conditions for the Panhandle area, extending into much of the Gulf of Alaska as well. MVFR conditions expected over the Copper River Basin and other areas of south central Alaska. Western part of the Kenai Peninsula and then down by Kodiak Island, MVFR conditions are expected, and around Bristol Bay as well. Then out through the central and southern portions of the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands, MVFR and IFR conditions are expected. Moving to our passes, starting up north at AKwx Pass, going to be VFR throughout the day on Wednesday, as well as at Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will both start off MVFR, however, Lake Clark will improve to VFR throughout the day. Then Rainy Pass will stay MVFR throughout the day on Wednesday, whereas Windy Pass will start off VFR, drop down to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Isabel Pass will be MVFR throughout the day, and Mentasta Pass will start off VFR, drop down to marginal in the afternoon. Down by Tanita Pass should be VFR all day on Wednesday, and Portage will start off MVFR, then improve to VFR conditions later in the afternoon. Down in southeast, Chilcano and White will both stay IFR throughout the day. Take a look now at our freezing level. Our freezing line hugging just to the north of the Panhandle area, then riding along the Gulf coastline through Kodiak Island, and out through the Alaska Peninsula into the central part of the Bering Sea. Our aloft temperatures are showing that we have a tongue of warmer air pushing into the southern portions of the Panhandle throughout the day on Wednesday. Then for our icing, below 7,000 feet is expected over the Panhandle area, extending out into the Gulf of Alaska and North Gulf Coast, between 3,000 and 10,000 feet expected there. Up a little bit higher out over the Bristol Bay area, between 5,000 and 10,000 feet. Then out by St. Paul, we do have below 3,000 feet expected, and then down along the Aleutian Islands, between 5,000 and 10,000 feet is expected on Wednesday. For our jet stream, 140 knot jet off to the south of the Aleutian Islands, but out through the Bering Sea, southeasterly jet around 95 knots is expected, moving over the Alaska Peninsula as well, and out over the northern part of the state, a 90 knot jet out of a westerly direction, dropping down to 70 knots as it exits to the east, and then just to the south of the Panhandle, a westerly component of the jet, 100 knots there. Down to 9,000 feet, flow out over the Panhandle area between 40 and 55 knots, strongest further to the south. Out over mainland Alaska, right along the coastline, as high as 35 knots is expected out of the east, dropping down pretty significantly over the state and becoming more northerly, 10 to 25 knots up along the Arctic coastline. Winds out over the Aleutians, 30 knots out of a southwesterly direction, and then becoming east out over the Bering Sea, up to as high as 45 knots in the northwestern portions of the Bering. Northerly component around 25 knots over the western Aleutians. Down to 3,000 feet, flow around our low pressure system as high as 35 knots, strongest on the southern portions out over the Aleutians, dropping down pretty quickly to around 15 knots, and then picking up again as we get into the northern part of the Bering Sea by St. Matthew Island, around 50 knots out of the east there. Out over mainland Alaska, we do have flow out of a primarily northerly direction, getting up to as high as 25 knots in the western parts of the interior. Picking up again as we get along the coastline in south central Alaska, as high as 45 knots expected there, and then southwesterly flow over the Panhandle, 35 to 50 knots. For our turbulence, with those stronger winds of the Panhandle, expecting turbulence below 6,000 feet. 6,000 feet expected along the North Gulf Coast as well, and then western portions of the state below 4,000 feet is expected.
Leatherbacks are the largest turtles on Earth, growing up to 7 feet long and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. These sea turtles are among the most highly migratory animals on Earth, some traveling up to 10,000 miles a year between their nesting and feeding grounds. Prevalent in every ocean except the Arctic and Antarctic, the species overall is declining, more so in the Pacific. In the eastern Pacific, the Mexican population was once thought to be the largest in the world and has experienced an alarming decline.
This trajectory of decline that we've seen, and actually collapse. We're talking about only 20 or 30 turtles nesting every year, where thousands used to just 40 years ago. That's the kind of dramatic decline.
The western Pacific population has been declining steadily, and it's particularly critical to act now before it collapses, while there are enough turtles in nests to respond to conservation measures. But threats to all leatherbacks in the Pacific need to be addressed.
The top threats to populations are uncontrolled coastal development, all the bad stuff on the nesting beaches, egg harvest, poaching of the females, predation on the eggs by dogs and pigs. Deforestation makes the sand too warm and dry and the eggs don't hatch. Another one is incidental capture in fishing gear. During their vast migrations, they get caught in fishing gear throughout the Pacific. And finally, marine debris, which the leatherbacks mistake for their favorite food, jellyfish, and they choke on those.
Protecting leatherbacks in U.S. waters alone is not enough to ensure the continued existence of the species. The highly migratory nature of Pacific leatherbacks requires cooperation and international collaboration. NOAA is focusing on partnerships with Mexico, Central America, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific.
Our action plan promotes a holistic recovery strategy that addresses all the sources of mortality. So that's basically ensuring that the remaining nesting sites are protected. And the nests produce as many hatchlings as possible. And then secondly, in tandem with that, is reducing the fisheries-related mortalities. We're working with international partners to incentivize community participation on the nesting beach conservation and developing alternative livelihood programs that wean communities off leatherback resources and introduce alternative methods for food and income. Recovery is going to take a long time, on the order of 20 to 30 years at least, before we see some of these actions bear fruit. But here in the US, we can all help leatherbacks by making seafood choices, for instance, that support sustainable fishing practices. And beachgoers can certainly do their part by keeping our oceans clean of plastic debris, picking up marine litter, particularly plastic bags.
Together with our partners, we are strengthening protection and conservation efforts to ensure a future for leatherbacks, helping them to survive and once again thrive in the waters of the Pacific Ocean.
For over 40 years, NOAA scientists have been collecting data and piecing together the story of the gray whale. Each year, new discoveries are made, revealing the secrets of this ancient traveler. With the northeastern Pacific population recovered, leading scientists from the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center continue their research efforts to help save the western population from extinction. The most effective way to identify individuals and count the population is to photograph them from the surface. Using the gray whale's distinctive markings and gray spots caused by parasites on their skin, scientists document these characteristics to identify individuals.
So we're able to track migratory pathways and corridors by the simple use of photo identification. There are other ways to do that as well, biopsy sampling and genetics.
And from the air.
Aerial photography is one way you can study animals based on their size and shape. So you can learn a lot about nutritive and reproductive condition of whales just by measuring their size and shape from vertical aerial photographs.
You can also put satellite transmitters on them and track them remotely. You put the transmitter on and let them go, and you watch them move across the Pacific or down to China or wherever it might be.
To further learn and discover where these great sojourners swim, the team of researchers traveled to Russia and set up camp on Sakhalin Island.
The main focus of our research while we were on Sakhalin was to collect photo identification. If it was a whale that we had not collected a genetic sample from previously, we would also attempt to collect a sample from the whales.
Whereas whales are endowed with natural insulation, their human observers must gear up to brave the cold in order to study these marine giants up close.
We're typically only able to work about 1/3 of the time that we're there, and that's mostly due to this fog that just invades the area and sits sometimes for weeks on end. So it can be very challenging to try and do field work in this site.
Recently, 2 whales from the western population surprised scientists by migrating across the Pacific to the waters of California and Mexico.
It's a really fun finding. It's added another piece to the puzzle that we didn't previously know about. And I would have to say that it's opened up more questions than we had before.
Research scientists from Japan, Russia, and the United States share images of animals they've spotted.
We take a photograph of an individual off of Sakhalin Island, and we get a phone call from Japanese scientists, and they say, hey, guess what? We've got a picture of a gray whale in Japan. We say, can you send it to us? We'd love to try and match it. They'll send us the picture, we'll compare it to our catalog, and we'll say, hey, we've got a match from Sakhalin to Japan.
Unlike many species of whales that still remain on the endangered species list, the eastern Pacific gray whale, once on the brink of extinction, now numbers about 20,000 individuals. Recovery efforts that started 40 years ago and the ongoing research and monitoring by NOAA scientists have contributed to the conservation of the gray whales. Together, with legal protection and public education, scientists are playing their part to ensure the survival of this magnificent migratory animal.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at our ice edge. We do have ice edge well south of Nunavik Island into the Bristol Bay area, not quite to the Pribilof Islands. And with the easterly winds that we're seeing, we're expecting that ice pack to push further to the west, and that's going to last through tomorrow. This is leaving some areas of Polinias along the west coast of the state. But as we move past tomorrow, we are expecting winds to calm down, so the ice pack will settle in a little bit. And then unexpected weather for the weekend is going to cause a variation depending on where a low pressure system moving into the Bering comes, where some areas will push back further to the north, whereas some areas further out west are going to move further to the south, depending on where the low actually resides. As we move in, we can zoom in on Cook Inlet area. We have ice well into the southern portions of Cook Inlet, down into Kamishak Bay as well. And at this point, not as much of the ice making into the northern parts of Shelikof as we saw in weeks previous. Start off with our Marines in the southeastern part of the state. Southerly winds 25 to 30 knots all around the Gulf, with seas as high as 19 feet. In the inside waters, we have southeasterly flow 25 to 35 knots, strongest in the south. And as we get further to the north in Lynn Canal area, we do have gusty winds getting up to as high as 40 knots up there. As we move into Thursday, southerly or southeasterly winds in the inside waters. Weaker up north, 15 knots there. In the central areas, 30, gust 35, and then further south we have 25 knots. Out over the Gulf of Alaska, southerly winds 25 to 30 knots, dropping down to 20 knots as we get closer towards Yakutat. For south central Alaska, starting off in the Gulf, primarily an easterly flow, 30 to 35 knots, a little bit weaker as we get further off to the east, and then 20 knots in Prince William Sound out of a northeasterly direction. For Cook Inlet area, northeasterly flow 20 knots, increasing to 30 knots as we get further to the south, and then by the Barren Islands, out of the north, 35 knots expected there. On Thursday in Cook Inlet, 10 to 15 knots out of a northeasterly direction, getting up to as high as 25 knots out of a northwesterly direction on the west side of the Barren Islands, 25 knots on the eastern side as well, 20 knots out over the Gulf of Alaska, and then in Prince William Sound we're looking at speeds around 15 knots out of the east. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island area, starting off around Kodiak Island, Shelikof Strait seeing the strongest winds, gale force winds of 35 knots out of the north, dropping down to 25 knots out of the west on the eastern side of the island with seas as high as 13 feet. So we move towards the Alaska Peninsula, 15 knots on the Pacific side, and then 15 to 20 knots on the Bering side, but a different change of directions, east to northeast on the Bering side. Then on Thursday, staying out of a northeasterly direction on the Bering side, around 10 knots, and becoming more westerly on the Pacific side, 15 to 20 knots. And those west winds, 20 to 25 knots around Kodiak Island, seas as high as 10 feet on the eastern and southern sides of the island. To move out over the Aleutian Islands, we have a south to southwest flow for the central and western Aleutians, 10 to 15 knots, strongest on the Pacific side. Looking out over the western Aleutians, becoming northerly out there, 15 to 20 knots with seas as high as 14 feet. Then on Thursday, all flow becoming more westerly, 10 to 15 knots out of the western Aleutian Islands, and that is going to continue out over the central and eastern Aleutian Islands as well. For the west coast of the state, primarily a north to northeasterly component to the winds, 20 to 25 knots, extending all the way down to the Pribilof Islands, with the exception of St. Matthew Island, a little bit stronger there, around 30 knots. As we move into Thursday, northerly flow all along the west coast, 15 knots, becoming easterly for St. Matthew Island and the Pribilof Islands, 15 to 20 knots there, with seas 5 to 6 feet. Along the Arctic coastline, we do have westerly winds, 10 to 15 knots, but as we drop down to the west coast of the state, becoming easterly and then northerly up to as high as 20 knots by the Bering Strait. So look on Thursday, northerly winds as we get by the Bering Strait area, 15 knots, transitioning over to southerly winds, 10 to 15 knots as we get up along the Arctic coastline, and variable winds around 10 knots as we get further off to the east. Taking a look at our weather for tonight, we do have a low pressure system by the western Aleutian Islands, bringing some snow to the islands and into the southern portions of the Bering Sea, with enough warm air for the central Aleutian Islands to transition things over to rain. As you look out over the Alaska Peninsula, we are going to see some snow there as well. And then our low moving into the Gulf of Alaska, bringing snow all along the North Gulf Coast into the southern portions of the Panhandle, and we do have warmer air coming up, transitioning things over to rain. However, as we get up by the Lynn Canal area, we do have snow expected for the area, with a winter storm warning for snow in effect that will be there until 6 a.m. on Wednesday. As we move along the coastline, we do have a blizzard warning in effect for the Thompson Pass area, and then a winter weather advisory for snow and blowing snow for Kodiak Island that should be expiring at 6 p.m. this evening on Tuesday. Much of the rest of the state, no precipitation. High pressure dominating the Arctic coastline with just some isolated showers in areas to the east, and we do have some blowing snow out over the Norton Sound area and St. Lawrence Island area.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.